Walter, I'm often criticized by not dealing with experiential aspects of religion and focusing on philosophy. But philosophy to me is the only way to have a rigorous approach to understanding religion. So I'm not going to be dissuaded by the criticism.
Good.
But want to continue to focus on how philosophy can inform religion. What are the categories that philosophy informs religion?
Well, it informs it in many different ways. I mean, historically, philosophy started off by changing religion in a radical way from polytheistic, spiritualistic views into monotheism within at least a lot of traditions. And then that one God became an all-powerful, all-good God. Well, all of those influences of there being one God and it being all-powerful, I think there were philosophical influences because people started wondering about philosophical puzzles raised by the prior religious beliefs, and that shaped the kind of religion that we have today. But to leave history and to turn to today, I think there are many issues there where philosophy can help religion. Religious people wonder about ethics, and philosophy can ask, what's the foundation of ethics? Religious people wonder about free will. They think that people do have free will, and philosophers can ask, does that really make sense? Religious people wonder about community, and philosophers can ask questions about, well, which communities are fair communities, and how should liberal governments, deal with small religious communities, and what's the value of those communities that ought to be recognized by liberal governments? That's political philosophy. And on a more metaphysical level, of course, does God exist? And philosophers have looked at the arguments for and against the existence of God in great detail and assessed them by the standard measures for argument validity and strength.
Many people, though, say that all of that is well and good, but you can't know God unless you feel and experience God.
Well, as an atheist, I don't think you can know God even if you do feel and experience God. So I think that's probably right, but what that really means is that the arguments aren't really driving it, and I think that's probably right. That very few people believe in God simply because they read the ontological argument or the cosmological argument and go, I never thought of that, but now I'm convinced. They have typically some type of religious experience that turns them into a believer. But then the philosopher can come and say, well, what about that experience? Why do you trust that experience? A lot of people have that experience. Matter of fact, most of the people that have that experience believe in a different God than you believe in. And so you have to think that that type of experience that you had can't be very reliable if it's leading people to all these different beliefs. And so the philosopher can then turn to the person whose faith is based on that experience and say, well, why do you trust it?
Let's look at the historical view, and what is the philosophical analysis that allows you to move or makes you move from a polytheistic, animistic kind of world to a monotheistic world? What are the kinds of questions? Because most people today would assume that the monotheistic God is the only way to go. And those people who might even reject philosophy won't realize that the progress to the monotheistic God was a philosophical process to begin with.
Right. So there are going to be social pressures, right? If we're in different villages and you've got your gods, plural, and I've got my gods, plural, right? Then you're going to say, but the God that's looking over our village is this one, and the God that's looking over my village is this other one. Well, I want my God to be more powerful than your God, so I make it more powerful. But then you just make one of your gods more. And pretty soon you're going to end up with this God that's more powerful than any other God could possibly be, right? Because now the other village can't beat me. So there are these pressures in culture and in social relations and in intergroup relations that lead pressure, that produce pressure in favor of a single monotheistic, all-powerful God. But there are also philosophical pressures. So if I've got my favorite God and you've got your favorite God, or better yet, if I've got a belief in more than one God, and this God said these are the standards, and this God says these are the standards, well, what am I going to do with those two sets of standards conflict? Now I'm kind of stuck. And if you want to avoid getting stuck in that way, you got to say there's really only one.
Right.
And so, that God has consistent standards.
And philosophy, at its core, is the resolution of contradiction or conflict or incoherence between views. Whether we do it in a professional way or we do it just in a human logical way, when you have these kinds of conflicts, you have to resolve it, or you have to discard the whole thing. So in order to maintain it in the light of contradiction, you have to resolve the contradiction.
Right. I see philosophy as the search for a justified, overall, coherent worldview. And so when you've got incompatibilities and conflicts, philosophers go crazy. They got to do something. Now, this is not true of all philosophers. There are philosophers today who believe in dialethism and paraconsistent logics. But that's the other aspect of philosophy. Nothing goes unquestioned. Most traditional philosophers look for a justified, overall, coherent worldview, but they're also willing to question anything. And that leads to people who even reject the view of philosophy as that search. Yes.
So as you now have that historical trend from polytheism to monotheism to a specific kind of God, you then carry it further as science develops to use philosophy to even undermine the more consistent God, which is the monotheistic God, which is more consistent than the previous ways of thinking. But now you feel some of those same techniques to take it to the next step.
Right. Because what happens historically is that you get certain claims about God from some traditions, and then they interact with other traditions. So you get a Judaic tradition, which has certain views about God, and then you get a Greek tradition, which says, well, if it's not infinite, it's nothing. And so then you want a single God who's infinitely, got to be good, got to be all powerful. And now you're adding all these different features, and then the philosopher goes, oh, wait a minute. Those aren't consistent. They're not coherent with what we observe in the world, namely that there's evil. And so the philosopher then shows that these two traditions, which seem to be wedded, need to be divorced. And that means you're going to have to make choices and modify. And that's, the philosopher then is leading to progress in the views of the religious people.